Yo, welcome back to the channel, boys and girls. In today's video, we are finally taking a look at my brand new TanTan x38 super duper Aero frame set. So in this video, guys, we're going to be going over all the different components that I put on this frame because it is pretty interesting. I've done a few things that are a little bit different than what I've done in some of my previous builds. Of course, I'm going to talk about the things I dislike about this bike. I'm going to talk about, of course, the things that I like about this bike, and then we're going to take it out on the road, and I'm going to give you my thoughts on this build because now I've been able to ride this bike for about 4 to 5 weeks or so. So without further ado, let's begin. All right, guys, so as I mentioned in the introduction to this video, this is my latest TanTan x38 frame set. As you guys can see, it is quite an Aero frame set, and this is really the main reason why I chose to buy this frame with my own money. I didn't have it sent out to me for review or anything like that. I paid with my own money, and the reason why I selected this frame is because this is, as you guys can see, it is unapologetically Aero, and a lot of bikes we're seeing today are sort of the one bike to rule them all. Of course, with the brand new Specialized SL8, a lot of frames now just don't look as Aero as this bike does here. So when I saw it on TanTan's website, I was like, yo, let me go ahead and buy this. So first, I'm going to start with the price of just the frame set itself. So the frame with shipping is going to run you about $700 USD. Expect it to arrive in about 3 to 4 weeks because it's coming all the way from China. Next up, let's talk about the paint job because there is no paint. This is completely raw carbon, unfinished. It's not painted. I haven't even put any sort of glossy or matte clear coat on it, which you shouldn't do because it's probably not good for the frame, but I mean, it's a $600 frame, so I don't really care too much. And being that it's unpainted, that does save a little bit of weight, maybe 100 to 200 grams. What I did do is I did put these kind of ghetto janky decals on here. I probably went a little bit OD with the decals, but they just kind of make it pop because the decals are gold, and of course it matches the gold accents on the rims. So before I go into more of the details, let's also talk about the weight of this bike because this bike is actually pretty light for what it is. So without a power meter, without pedals, without a computer mount, all that stuff, just a stock bike that you would expect to buy in a store, this bike actually weighs only about 7.3 kilograms for the frame. That's right, 7.3 kilograms for a cheap all-out Aero frame. So now let's talk about how that is possible. So first up, we have the integrated cockpit. This is a 120 stem, and the width on these is like I think it's 40 centimeters. Supercast bar tape. We have SRAM Axis eTap Force. I've been running that on my Specialized LA Sprint, and I like it a lot. Next up, let's move on to the saddle. Now, this is a full-on carbon saddle. This is a S-Works power saddle in 143 millimeters with the 7x9 carbon rails. I like this saddle a lot. I also run this on my Specialized LA Sprint. I like it a lot. Next up, let's talk about the 1x setup. So this is my very first time running 1x, not just on a road setup, but actually on all my bikes all together. Now, you're probably wondering, why am I running a 1x? Well, as I've said plenty of times on this channel now for like basically the last 3 years, Chicago is very flat, and I never ever use the small ring on any of my other road bikes, so I figured it would be appropriate to experiment it on such a cheap, affordable bike. So the chainring you see here is it's by PassQuest. You can purchase this chainring from AliExpress. It's going to run you about, I don't know, maybe like $40–50. It's going to take about 4 weeks to ship, but this is a 52 tooth chainring. Now you're probably saying that's not that large for an Aero chainring, right, for 1x, but keep in mind that this is a SRAM eTap axis setup. So we have back for the cassette, we have a 10 to 30. So at the largest cog, or the biggest setup I would have, which would be the 52x10, that's basically like the equivalent to like a 57x11 in a Shimano drivetrain setup. Now I like to say I'm pretty strong as a rider. I am by no means anywhere near that strong to be able to crank out the equivalent of a 5211 I'm sorry, 57-11 or 52-10 gear. There's no way. The reason why I did this setup is simply for drivetrain efficiency, because when I'm cruising along, especially doing some of the fast group rides here in Chicago, I want to make sure that my chain is more or less within the middle cogs of the cassette. And by running this 52 tooth Aero chainring, I'll have all the gears I want, and I'll have this sort of drivetrain efficiency, because it seems like that's one of the things that people have been talking about basically making sure your drivetrain is efficient. So that's the whole setup here. Of course, I have my Quarq spider based power meter. I have these Look carbon ceramic pedals. I've been using these for like the last 3 years. I really like the setup on them. Super reliable, and everything just spins well. Alrighty, now the next thing I want to talk about, which you can't see, is I am running a ceramic T47 bottom bracket courtesy of Joe at Panda Podium. He did not send this out to me for free. I did pay for it with my own money, although he did offer just a tiny discount. Now, obviously, you guys know that I have a great relationship with Joe. I really love what he's doing with his brand new website, Panda Podium. He's got some great stuff on his website. I do definitely want to check out some of his latest wheel sets that he's been offering that I hear are supposed to be a game changer. So if you haven't already, please make sure to visit Joe's website, Panda Podium. I'll be sure to link his website down below. Yeah, so the bottom bracket is ceramic bearings, hybrid ceramics, I don't really know, but super duper smooth, super buttery. The retail on this ceramic bottom bracket from Panda Podium is like $100 USD, and so far as I've been running it, it's been really good. It's good as the sort of ceramic bearings version of SRAM's own in-house bottom bracket, and it's also just as good as Kogel bearings. That's also a brand of ceramic bearings that I've been using in the past, and this one has been just as good as those, and it's half the price. So for $100 for a ceramic bottom bracket, especially from a brand that I like that offers good customer service, it's a no-brainer. Next up, let's talk about the wheels. All right, guys, so next up are these wheels. Now, these wheels have truly been special. Now, I've been running these wheels back and forth on this frame, the X38 TanTan, as well as my Specialized LA Sprint, and no lie, these are some of the best wheels that I've ever used. So let me give you some of the specs on these. So these are from Magene. I am going to do a separate video on these wheels, but this is Magene's latest set of wheels. This is their DB508 EXAR Ultra wheels. But basically what you need to know is you have 50 millimeters in the front, 58 in the rear. We have carbon spokes, ceramic bearings. We have a external width of 30 millimeters and an internal width of 23. And then the weight for these are like, I want to say these are the second lightest set of wheels that I've ever tested on this channel. I want to say these come in just at like 1,380 grams, something crazy like that. So basically, you know, some of the lightest wheels that you can buy in the market. Retail on these, I believe they are $1,200 USD, but these wheels, man, guys, I'm not kidding you. Like I've said this before, and I've said maybe a lot of sort of exaggerations or hyperboles, but for sure, these are some of the best wheels I've tested, no question. I would put them slightly above the Elite Drive set wheels, just a hair below the Windspace Hyper, the D67. Only difference is because these are not that deep of wheels, so it's hard to do a true apples to apple comparison on, say, like the Elite Drive 65s or the D67 Windspace Hypers. But if you're looking for a wheel set in that 50 to 60 millimeter depth range, these are the ones I would pick, no questions asked. And because they offer up a 23 millimeter internal, that basically plumps up my set of Continental GP5000 28 wheels to basically almost like 29 or 30 millimeter width because of just how wide the internal width is on these wheels. So that obviously offers up a very comfortable ride. For my weight, I'm pumping these up at about 74 kilograms, and even that might still be a little bit too high, but it definitely does take out some of the harshness on this bike. So let's continue. Alrighty, so as I mentioned, guys, this bike weighs about 7.3 kilograms, which is a pretty good weight considering this is an all-out aero bike. It's not intended to be a climber or one bike to rule them all sort of frame. This is obviously an aero bike, and it does, of course, resemble the Scott Foil RC Pro, whatever it's called. So now you're wondering, how did I make this bike so light? So let's first start with some of the obvious things. So the first thing is this saddle. This saddle comes in less than 200 grams. It comes in, I don't know, I think it's like 160 or something like that. So that obviously helps. We have the carbon cockpit, so that of course makes the weight a little bit less too. Like I said, these wheels, because they're only like 1,390 grams, obviously that makes it very, very light. And even just by going by removing the front derailleur and the battery, that also removes like 200 grams. Another thing too is instead of using latex inner tubes, I decided to test out the TPU inner tubes. They are a little bit more pricey than the actually no, that's not true. Actually nowadays you can get TPUs for about the same price as latex tubes. The difference being is that if you go with TPU inner tubes, you're going to save a total of about 45 to 50 grams per tire. So now we're talking about 100 grams total just by switching from latex inner tubes to TPU. So you figure you're saving 100 grams from the inner tubes. You're saving like 200 grams because these wheels are super duper light. You're saving another 200 grams by ditching the front derailleur and the heavy battery from SRAM. You also are using a carbon saddle, and then of course you have the carbon cockpit. So all those things collectively, this bike can easily be closer to say 7.9 kilograms or 8 kilograms total. But by removing all that stuff, all the things I don't really need, especially for the type of roads that I ride here in Chicago, that's what brings this bike down to about 7.3 kilograms. And it's so interesting because when I pick up this bike versus my Windspace and of course my Specialized LA Sprint, you can definitely feel when you pick it up. I'm not talking about road feel or anything like that, but you can definitely tell that this bike is significantly lighter than those bikes. So anyway, guys, let's go ahead and talk about the things that I dislike about this bike. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the size on this frame. So this frame set is a 56 size on the frame. My saddle height is about 77.7 centimeters from the center of the bottom bracket up to the center point on the top of the saddle. So anyway, let's talk about the things I dislike about this bike. Okay, so the first thing I dislike about this frame is because I opted to not paint the frame, which you should paint your frame, you should at least do a layer of clear coat protection, is because the bike is unpainted, it unfortunately makes the headset bearings, it makes them rattle, not necessarily physically. You can't feel it out on the ride, or if you were to hold the front brake, you can't feel it. So it's definitely secure in place, but it does make a rattling noise when you go over bumps. And I think the only reason why it's doing it is because, you know, the tolerances on the headset cup, obviously it's intended to be painted to make those bearings be a little bit tighter and have them seat just a little bit more tighter inside of the cup. So that's, I suppose, not really a negative, you know, because if you paint your frame, this problem should be gone. But if you choose to not paint your frame like myself, or if you choose to use a very thin layer of paint, you will probably need to add some sort of helicopter tape, something like that, just to make the bearing sit a little bit tighter inside of the headset. The second dislike that I have for this bike is, as you can see, this is running the style of this saddle clamp that you can basically move the saddle fore and aft without having to actually loosen and adjust the saddle itself. Now, some people like this style, others don't. I don't mind it. Yolio, they're notorious for using this style, so I've gotten used to it. However, the problem for some reason on this particular frame set is when I loosen up these two bolts inside to be able to move the saddle fore and aft, it doesn't give me all of the range within the track. So on here I should have maybe, I don't know, maybe 2 centimeters front and back to be able to adjust the saddle, but for some reason it's stuck. And I don't know why. It's not like completely stuck, but instead of giving me that 2 centimeters of fore and aft, I'm only getting like maybe 1 centimeter of movement. So that means that if I need to make any super extreme adjustments to the saddle fore and aft, I can't use that while keeping my saddle where it's at as far as position goes. I have to basically loosen the whole entire saddle and move it back. So I'm sure maybe if I were to use a little bit of extra force, I could probably fix that, but just keep that in mind. And maybe this is just because my frame is unpainted, I don't really know. But yeah, for some reason I'm only getting about 1 centimeter of fore and aft allowance versus the standard maybe 2 centimeters. All right, and the third thing I dislike about this frame, and this does just come with the territory when you buy a cheap Chinese frame, is it took quite a while to align the caliper to the the rotor, because even though there was some effort to face the caliper mounts, albeit, you know, the frame is unpainted, TanTan did not do a great job. So the front caliper was okay, but for some reason the rear caliper, it took a while. It took a while to finally get it dialed in. But now I've got everything lined perfectly to the point where I can take the rim on and off. I can remove the rotor on and off, put everything back on, and everything will still be perfectly in line. So just keep that in mind, that it's going to take some patience to get everything aligned, because that is what you're paying for, or I should say not paying for, when you are dealing with these sort of do-it-yourself, you know, cheap bike frames from China. Next up, let's talk about some of the things that I like about this frame before we get on to sort of the on-road impressions on this frame. So number one, I do like the weight of the frame. It's only about 1,100 grams, which isn't bad. Again, if you add paint, it's probably like maybe 1,200 grams, but that's not bad considering, you know, this is an Aero frame. So I like the weight of this frame. So kudos to TanTan for that. I really like this, the seat post. Now you would think that having a seat post like this, that it would just basically offer up all this harsh feedback from the road, but I've actually found it to be the opposite. In fact, this chunky seat post, it actually soaks up a lot of the bumps, and I can confirm this because when Cam Nichols reviewed his Elves Falloff Pro or whatever the Aero frame he had, he said the same exact thing. He said that the chunky seat post on the Elves frame, he thought it would be super duper harsh as far as road feel goes, but it ended up being quite comfortable. And I can also confirm with Cam Nichols is that this style of seat post, which is going back to the negatives really quickly, is all of your rear light mounts, because this is a very chunky boy. You have to be mindful that probably your mounts are not gonna fit. So just you're gonna have to figure out what you're gonna do to mount this. This light, this bond trigger works okay, but it's basically at the limit as far as stretching out the rubber to the absolute limit. I like the overall look of this frame. Like I said in the introduction, guys, you know, there aren't really too many frames, cheap frames on the market that are really offering up this sort of super Aero looking profile, and I think that TanTan did a great job with this frame set. So yeah, those are the dislikes. I mentioned the likes, so now let's take this. All right, you guys want to see my face, right? So let's take this out on the road, and I'm gonna let you know how this bike feels. So let's continue. Alrighty, so we are out taking the TanTan x38 for a spin. Like I said, guys, I've been riding this bike for about 4 to 5 weeks now, and I've put it through all my usual paces. So of course, sprinting, taking it out for some sort of, you know, spirited efforts, and yeah, I want to share some of my thoughts on this. So I don't want to get hit. Alrighty, so how does this bike feel out on the road? It feels okay. It's not as super racy as I expected it to be honest with you, but it definitely is a suitable ride and feeling for a $600 frame. I know you guys want me to compare this to a Windspace or a Specialized LA Sprint, and obviously it is unfair to compare this to that because those bikes are like 3 times the price. One of the things with this frame is it's not super duper harsh or anything like that. It's just not a very refined ride. Could you do some fast group rides with this? Of course you could. That's not going to be an issue or anything like that, but it's not going to be the most refined ride you've ever had in your life. I don't know if that's just because of the geometry. It could be just of my bike position on this frame. Like I said, it's not sloppy or messy. It's just not going to be super composed, and that becomes apparent quickly when you are out on rough roads. Now, with that being said, despite the lack of refinement this frame has over rough pavement, and I know it's the frame and it's not the bike as a whole because I've been using these wheels with my Specialized LA Sprint, is that despite the lack of refinement on this frame, where the speed really kicks in is when you start getting above 22 to 23 miles an hour. That's where this bike really shines. I don't want to use the term that it holds its speed really well because I don't have any scientific way to measure that. But once the pace gets going and once you get up to speed, you can tell that this is where this bike likes to live. It's not going to be the best climber, but when it comes to sprinting and when this pace gets really spicy, you can tangibly feel that, yo, this is definitely not a climbing bike. This is a bike that's made for speed. And for $600, I mean, it's gonna be really hard to complain because it's an Aero bike. It's comfortable in the saddle, believe it or not. It's just, you know, not super duper refined over rough pavement which Chicago has a lot of bad pavement. So like, you know, I'm running 28 C tires on these wheels. I would highly suggest to not use 25C because the ride's not going to be punishing, but I think it's just going to exacerbate the sort of sloppiness that this frame has when you're going over rough pavement. Now, going back to the sort of ride feeling on the road as far as the lack of refinement, this unfortunately has been one of my main gripes when it comes to dealing with these cheap bikes. Now, obviously for $600, you can't expect anything mind-blowing. And like I said, these are all sort of marginal nitpicks that I have with this bike. I'm not saying this frame is crap. It absolutely is not. I think for $600, I can recommend this frame to you guys based on the amount of riding and testing I've done with this bike. But I just do want to set the expectations that, you know, a bike like this is not going to compete with anything significantly higher in price than what this bike is. At the end of the day, you know, it's an open mold frame. It's a Chinese bike. Customer service is pretty good. You know, the bike came in like 3 weeks or so. I know I sound kind of monotone, but part of the reason why I'm sort of monotone is because, to be honest with you guys, reviewing all these cheap frames, it's gotten kind of monotonous. And after a while, you realize that a lot of these Chinese bikes, if I'm being honest, a lot of them are the same.
Final thoughts on the TanTan x38 frame set. When I was building this up, I was really excited because I thought maybe this frame set could replace my Specialized LA Sprint. And I think that was my first mistake, expecting a $600 frame to replace such an amazing bike, in my opinion, as a Specialized LA Sprint. For this frame, it does have a lot of things going for it. I really like the Aero profile. I like the chunky but comfortable seat posts. I really like the sense of speed you get when the pace gets fast, and just the unique look of this frame set, especially in the world of SO7 and SO8 clones. This is something that's difficult to find in general, and it's especially difficult to find around $600 USD. For my bike fit having such a long and low reach, I really couldn't get the bike fit set up for my style of riding because the geometry just doesn't suit me that well. Both the stack and the head tube are pretty tall, which makes setting up the saddle and handlebars for me pretty difficult. Again, this is just a rider issue, not necessarily a problem with the frame. For such an Aero looking frame, it really isn't as stiff as my Dangfu R12, although that frame is out of production, or the VeloBuild 177, despite all three frames basically being around the same weight. My guess is it seems like TanTan is probably using the same typical volume of carbon overall for this frame and the price point as both the Dangfu and the VeloBuild. However, the carbon thickness or the carbon walls are less in order to accommodate having more of an Aero tubing profile. Now, when the speeds get fast, this frame is going to put a smile on your face, trust me. However, you will be constantly reminded that you're riding on bad roads, and you also will be reminded that you are just riding a $600 frame versus riding a $1,500 frame. Now, for $600 overall, I can recommend this frame set simply for the sake of it looks super Aero, it has a frame geometry to accommodate most people, it likes to go fast, and it does offer up a decently comfortable ride. Now, if you want a cheap, super Aero looking frame, this is basically your only option for $600. However, for my money personally, I would rather take the Dangfu R12 or the VeloBuild 177 because both of those frames will offer up a stiffer ride and they do offer up a little bit better road composure. They just won't look as Aero. That's going to do it for today's video, guys. Thank you for sticking with me all the way to the end. Of course, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to leave them down below, and I will check you on the next one. And also, too, a big thank you to Joe at Panda Podium for helping me get my hands on their ceramic bearings T47 bottom bracket. Anyway, guys, I will talk to you on the next one. Peace.